So, caught up in work, but I want to do more. Similar thing. Expectations, time and space. Once again, opportunities, right? So there's an opportunity structure here that may keep us from being engaged at the intersection between research and practice as deeply as we would like to be. And that opportunity structure, if you think about kind of the space in which each one of us is doing both research and practice in our own small and in some cases very large ways, is itself embedded within what some people have called it a bureaucratic organizational structure, right? So if we view each of us around our various tables as both researchers and to some extent practitioners, or practitioners and to some extent researchers, let's also think about the opportunities that we have individually and as groups to engage in both research and practice. That's important because it begins to personalize what otherwise can be a very academic, tendentious, and very abstract conversation around, well, is it policy? Is it funding? Well, that's when you're talking about it with other people. But when you're talking about it in terms of our own careers, and I'm using the pronoun our advisedly, or when I think about it in terms of the opportunities that I have for creative engagement at the intersection of research and practice, I don't think about it necessarily only in such abstract terms as, well, it's a bureaucratic organizational structure, or it's policy constraints, or it's the lack of available technical assistance, or it's the culture of innovation and creativity. I think about it as all being relevant. And so if you think about, once again, the purpose of my talk, it really is to talk about all of those things. And interestingly enough, they're all interrelated, one might say. And at the same time, here's the really cool thing. We know so little about the specific mechanisms, processes, and pathways through which we are not able to, not allowed to, in some cases not interested in, bridging this research and practice gap. So we are, some might say, at the very beginning stages of starting to understand how to build this bridge between research and practice, which creates for us a sense of opportunity, but also creates a sense, for many of us, a challenge. If it's important indeed to build this bridge between research and practice, both in terms of frontline practice, in terms of organizational practice, then it's important for us to start to think about how do we cross this chasm, as wide or as small as it is. So with your patience, can you hear me? What I'm going to do is I'm going to flip ahead to perhaps a visual summary that might in some way mirror the conversation that we're beginning to have. And I'm assuming that we all have this set of PowerPoints in our handbook. And so if you'd like, I'd be happy to have a conversation either later in the question and answer session, or certainly tomorrow during our workshop and our breakout sessions, in order to kind of further clarify what some of the points in here are. But I want to be mindful of my time, and I also want to be mindful of my utility. I think it's important for me to give us something that might be useful for us to think about this large issue around bridging the research and practice gap. So even a very cursory analysis of the theoretical literature and the conceptual and the empirical literature on the research and practice gap might seek to identify the locus of that goal. And from an organizational perspective, and here I have to digress and say I tend to be organizationally inclined, both in terms of my training as well as my theoretical approach, as well as in the way in which I work with, in partnership, with individual consumers, be they consumers at the front line, community, organizational, and systemic levels. But as we think about kind of the potential drivers for that gap, we oftentimes think about different buckets. So buckets is a very technical term, by the way. So let's use buckets advisedly. So we tend to think about different buckets in which to put different possible explanations for why this gap exists. And as you can see in this slide, those buckets tend to be of different names. One is institutional, organizational and culture and climate, leadership and management, workforce development, and finally social support. And what I'd like to do is take a little bit of time to kind of go through common challenges and potential strategies for addressing these common challenges in each of these 5 buckets, with the idea that it will, if nothing else in my short time, give us a basic sense of what some of the challenges may be in addressing the research practice gap from an organizational and administrative perspective, and also might point us in some directions for future research. We don't necessarily need to be researchers in order to think about research. That's the whole point behind bridging the research and practice gap. So if you're a researcher and you're thinking about the research and practice gap, there are some strategies I would suggest we think about. And if you're a quote-unquote practitioner only, I also think it might be important for us to think about additional research that we need in order to think about how to bridge this gap. So let's start with institutional challenges and potential strategies for addressing those challenges. Now, this, I would imagine, looks very similar to what we have been talking about. Challenges on the far left column, possible support strategies or ways of mitigating those challenges on the far right column, as you can see. And I hope that the font is okay. So the first challenge, and obviously these are thematically linked, is that research is viewed as top-down and irrelevant for practice. The second one, as you can see, few requirements or incentives for experimentation. So this wonderful phrase that this group used around a culture of innovation and creativity. From an institutional perspective, there actually might be barricades to that. There might not be incentives for it, and there might be requirements at policy fiscal level preventing us from engaging in experimentation in terms of moving towards promising practices, testing out different frontline approaches, and thinking flexibly about what does service delivery look like if we link it to promising research strategies. And similarly, few opportunities for testing novel practice approaches. In general, if I were to boil down those three challenges on the very far left into a pithy explanation for why it arises, I would say we are engaged in a culture of compliance, where we are seeking through frontline practice, through management, and through administrative strategies to produce, procure, and emancipate data from our coffers to the benefit of policymakers and funders. Not from an organizational learning perspective, but indeed from a client's perspective, from a compliance perspective. So we are doing these things not because they benefit us in terms of organizational learning and improvement, but we do them because they're of interest to what? Funders, policymakers. This is an old adage in human services, and it might be summarized by saying, he who pays the piper calls the tune. So oftentimes if we think about kind of what is it that we're doing in terms of not linking research and practice, we might think about, well, we're not able to link research and practice, not just because we're not able to do these things, but because we're precluded in some sense from doing these things. So this would be an example of an institutional challenge. And as you can see on the far right, here are some support strategies, setting aside the potential feasibility or fundability of these strategies. These are some potential support strategies. So turning in the interest of time to culture and climate, and this we've alluded to in many of our comments from our groups, lack of learning organizational perspective, emphasizing experimentation and critical thinking. This is such an important and lovely idea. The idea that we can be, as organizations and as human service providers, fountains of experimentation and critical thinking, debate, challenge, and dialogue. And as you can see on the far left, one possible contributor at an organizational level, and in particular in terms of culture and climate, to this research to practice gap might be our unwillingness, our inability, and our lack of resources in order to support a culture that really does prize experimentation. So we have what's called a defensive risk-averse culture. And as you can see in the far right, and I'll just spend a little bit of time on this, we might think of these support strategies as being perhaps conceptualized as both formal and informal. Some people call them hard versus soft. I like formal versus informal. So R&D units, CIOs, Chief Innovation Officers, what a lovely idea. We're starting to see some of that in the Pacific Northwest, and I've seen some of that in other domains of practice across other regions in the United States. Chief Innovation Officers. This is an idea that we've essentially stolen from the for-profit business sector, particularly in Silicon Valley and Silicon Forest in the Pacific Northwest. The idea of these individuals is that they're supposed to be symbols of and to role model, and in some cases to institutionalize the whole point behind service delivery, change, experimentation, and innovation. So the idea that we not just have a general emphasis on testing, on linking research and practice in useful ways to benefit multiple types of consumers and stakeholders, but that we have institutionalized it in both informal and formal ways is very important. And as you can see here in the bottom right quadrant, informal strategies might include strengthening research networks anchored by link officers, and some people have called them boundary spanners. And then institutionalizing critical analysis of success and failure. And in particular here, we're thinking about an application of what's called an M&M conference, morbidity and mortality conferences, which are very common in teaching academic institutions, or academic medical institutions. So it's the idea that in contrast to critical case reviews in child welfare and other human service systems, wherein people analyze critical case failures, we instead have a regular mechanism for discussing not just failure, but also success that is essentially analogous to an all-staff meeting. So think about the last all-staff meeting that you had. Did you talk about organizational improvement? If you did, it might have been top-down. The M&M conferences are supposed to be collegial, democratic, all participate, and the presentation of cases is rotated on a consistent basis. Regardless of rank, all are required to discuss failure and success, and each of them is treated equivalently for organizational learning. Leadership and management challenges, I won't belabor this because we've spent a lot of time over the course of this day already talking about the importance of modeling research-minded practice. So it obviously thrusts a different set of expectations, I would say, on managers, because those of us who envision ourselves as being useful both around research and also around practice are, in some cases, as per this slide, required to provide that linkage function and to model it for our staff and for our colleagues. And that sets us off to some extent, and it also contributes to something in the literature that suggests that being both a researcher as well as a practitioner is in some cases a very lonely, solitary enterprise, because we often don't do it much. And when we are viewed as being one of those, what are sometimes called link officers or boundary spanners, we are to some extent either formally or in terms of the informal climate of the organization set off from other individuals who may not be as interested in linking research to practice. And that gets at some of the issues around what does it mean at a social level to link research and practice. So we tend to think institutionally, well, lack of resources, lack of support, funders aren't willing to allow us to do that. We don't think as much, at least when I say we, I'm thinking about the academic literature. We don't think as much about the social pressures to not engage in research, given that many of our colleague practitioners are not as interested, have time for, or research. What sorts of pressures does that create for us? Do we have to kind of keep research on the down low to some extent? If we're practitioners who also have research interests and who, in some cases, may be actually doing research. Workforce development. We hit this really well. Practitioner research anxiety, insufficient time, training, and or interest in research, lack of access to relevant, engaging research training and professional development. I don't think there's anything I could add here besides to say this tends to be the area that is given most emphasis and has afforded the most significant pride of place in the academic literature on why the research to practice gap exists from an organizational perspective. At a proximal level, people aren't able to engage in research because they don't have the time. They don't have the training in terms of technical assistance. There are resources that could be provided that are not necessarily available. But as we're starting to think about this relationship between workforce development and the research to practice gap is also accompanied by other cousins in terms of organizational culture and climate, in terms of institutional reasons why that research to practice gap might exist. And so if we were to focus only on workforce development challenges, we might be missing some other potential drivers of that research to practice gap that might be equally, if not more important. So what I'm getting at is this large point that just about everything might be involved in thinking about how do we reduce the size of that distance, the distance in general, between research and practice. And unfortunately, and this is something I'll allude to a little bit later with my limited time, I have 5 minutes now. No, this is great. So in my remaining 5 minutes is that in terms of needs for research, there's so much out there, and I'm so excited to talk about it. So in terms of social support challenges, the only thing I'll emphasize on the far left is this word safe. Lack of support networks and dedicated and safe spaces to reflect on key organizational practices. It's one thing to have dedicated spaces to reflect on key organizational practices. So there might be, for example, a room, a conceptual room dedicated to linking research and practice. But if it's not safe, it's not going to be used. So we oftentimes think about both use and utility. It has to be used and it has to be useful. That social support, if it's provided, that social support function, it has to be both used and useful. There has to be an issue of safety here. So with my remaining time, I think what I'll do is I'll end by talking about 3 types of research that I would suggest we all think about from our various positionalities around this research to practice gap. And I would urge us to think about it not just from our own positionalities, but from the other side's positionality. So if you identify yourself principally as a practitioner, think about these questions from a research perspective. And if you tend to identify yourself principally as a researcher or a lapsed practitioner, let's think about it from the other side. And let's try to bridge that gap, so to speak, conceptually, so as to think about both research needs as well as practice needs. So it seems very interesting to me that even though we spend a lot of time talking about this research to practice gap, I'm not sure, outside of a few specific literatures that have to do with ESIs and ESTs, that we really know what we're talking about. There's a lot of research out there that isn't big R research, that is small R research, and it seems to me that as though we should spend some time actually looking at the research that is being done and the people who are doing all different sorts of research. And so there's a diversity or a heterogeneity in the experiences of individual staff, volunteers, and researchers who are engaged in different agency-based settings doing what's called quote-unquote research. What do we know about these individuals? What do we know about these projects? We have lots of anecdotal information, but if we were to kind of summarize it, what would we find? And I'm not sure we would be looking at only one theme or only a small set of things. I think what we're looking at is the beginning of our development of a knowledge base on our lack of a knowledge base pertaining to the research to practice gap. So it might be important for us to both document the incidence of research-minded practice, this linkage between research and practice, but also to identify those people who are, as you can see in the second bullet point, actually doing it. And then both describing the research that is being done and the characteristics of individuals, as well as you can see in this slide, starting to understand similarities and differences in the experiences of different people who may be engaged in different types of research. So, once again, thinking about ourselves as individual practitioners and researchers and practitioners, ask yourself, I will ask myself, is the research that I'm engaged in all of one type, or does it change? Does it wax and wane in intensity and type, in importance, in innovativeness, in relevance, depending upon the organizational context, the particular developmental period in which I am engaged? And the answer is yes. Research, just like practice, waxes and wanes. It changes, it's fluid, it's multidimensional, we might say. So if that's the case, we wouldn't expect a static understanding of research and practice and that gap, or the bridges in between it. So we should therefore understand and seek to understand the relevance of the organizational environment to how research and practice are enacted over time in different settings for different consumers as well as different practitioners. And then finally, if we were to understand that, we might want to spend a little bit of time thinking about how we integrate research and practice into what we do in terms of OD, which is organizational development. If we think about the research to practice gap as being one manifestation of an overall set of issues that we have in the human services related to delivering services better, quote unquote better, for children, youth, and families and other clients, then it might be important for us to think about the relationship between bridging that gap and ultimately organizational effectiveness, efficiency, reliability, equity, and importance. So I think on that note, I'm getting the signal that my time is up. So once again, I thank you for your time, and I'll look forward to your questions.